Hello, and welcome to this series of podcasts from Parallel Project Training. We've recorded a series of podcasts that are for the new APM syllabus for exams starting in September 2024. This one is on life cycles. My name's Ruth Phillips, and I'm here with one of Parallel's senior trainers, Carmen Campos, to talk about that topic today. Welcome to the podcast, Carmen.
Hello, thank you.
So let's talk about life cycles then. This is a decision that we need to make early on in our project as to what type of life cycle that we're going to use. How do we define a project life cycle?
So a project life cycle is simply the framework that the project will use to manage the progression through the phases. It basically sets out what is going to be the high-level structure of those phases from cradle to grave. Here we don't have universal best practice. We have different options. So organizations will have to make decisions and choose from which life cycle they will adopt to deliver the projects.
Okay, so we've got a choice of different life cycles. And if we look at the syllabus, the first learning outcome is that the APM would like us to understand the distinctive features of different life cycles. They mention linear, iterative and hybrid life cycles. Know when each of those is applicable. And then the fourth learning outcome for this syllabus item is that we've got to understand the strengths and limitations of each different life cycle. So, Carmen, let's talk about each one of these life cycles now. Should we take the linear life cycle first of all?
So when selecting the right life cycles, we're going to have to make sure we choose the right approach because it will determine the way that the project will operate. So a linear approach will suit projects that have a very well established knowledge of the scope and the context. These type of life cycles have 4 key phases. So I'm going to use the terminology that aligns with the APM terms for the phases. So the first phase is concept. During concept, you develop the initial idea for the project.
Okay.
In this phase, we will develop a project business case, which outlines the purpose of the project. It also sets out the high-level objectives, the scope, and assess as well whether the project is viable.
Okay.
So once the formal acceptance of the business case is to proceed, the next phase is the definition. So now we're ready to do a more detailed planning.
Okay.
In the definition, we will produce an integrated project management plan. So now we are investing all the effort and time to produce a scope, breakdown structures, schedule, the cost plan, securing resources, produce all the plans for risk, communication, quality management, stakeholder management plans, and check that it is still viable to proceed with that once we have the full definition of it.
Yeah, okay. So concept then, high level about the feasibility, the viability of the project. We get approval. We then move into definition, which gives us the detailed planning. And again, then we need to have approval before we move into the next stage. What's that third stage then?
So once we have approval, we move into deployment. The deployment is essentially the execution of the project. Now we need to deliver all the products to achieve the outcomes and benefits for the project.
Right.
So in the deployment phase, we may decide to have smaller interim stages in it. And once we ensure that the deliverables have been completed and meet the quality standards and the requirements set up in the definition, then we can start progressing with the last phase, which is the transition into BAU.
Okay, so deployment could be over many years, couldn't it, for some very large projects?
It could be for some complex infrastructure projects.
Yeah. So what's the final stage then?
So that final stage is your transition to business as usual. The 4 phase will include the handover of the products that the project has completed, commissioning, obtaining the formal acceptance from the client or the users, and then it's quite important as well during the transition to document all the lessons learned.
So I'm getting an impression here of a linear life cycle being this sequential framework and these 4 phases of a project to make sure that we identify the right projects, we plan them in detail, we control and have good governance over the deployment, and then we've got a controlled handover or transition of our deliverables into BAU and then closing the project down.
Yes, this is one of the strengths of this life
Yeah.
cycle, because some projects really need that sequential and maximum control and governance. We cannot move to the next phase unless we have achieved all the necessary steps. This is one of the key benefits of choosing a linear life cycle.
Okay. What are some of the other strengths of a linear life cycle?
So there are other strengths in terms of planning. By having defined set of phases or stages, it gives more attention to those earlier ones. You cannot start spending a lot of time planning in detail until your business case has been approved. You cannot start doing the work until your resources have been secured and the project management plan has been signed off. So it gives the project manager that early attention, because the definition phase for these type of projects is very important.
Are there any limitations for a linear life cycle? When wouldn't it be quite so suitable?
One of the key limitations is that this approach is quite inflexible. You have maximum control and you have very rigorous gateways. So it could be quite inflexible for things like accommodating change. You need to follow a very strict change control process. And also because this linear life cycle requires early definition of the requirements, it may only be suitable for projects that have clearly defined and well understood the scope.
That makes sense. So that's our linear life cycle then. The next type of life cycle that the APM mentions is an iterative life cycle. What's an iterative life cycle, Carmen?
So iterative life cycles are life cycles that gives you more flexibility. So for some projects, you may not know your scope at front and you need a more evolutionary development, such as projects that use agile methodologies. So the key characteristics is that you will have repeated iterations, repeated cycles of your execution.
Okay, so rather than having those sequential phases that we talked about, this is much more a cyclical, iterative process.
Exactly. It also has phases. So an iterative life cycle will have a pre-project, similar to concept. Pre-project will focus on how do we select the right project, and then does it fit within the organizational strategy and goals. And if the answer is yes, we move forward to the next phase. So the next phase is your feasibility. So the key questions that we need to answer here is it commercially feasible? How are we going to get the funding? Is it even technically possible? So it's very similar to the concept as well in linear, but it's a slightly different focus. It looks at the project from a slightly different lenses. If it's feasible, we have foundations. So we have so far pre-project, feasibility, and now we're moving into foundations. This is the planning phase, but you plan slightly different to the way you plan in your definition phase. What we plan here is your time, your resources, and hence your cost. So you check, do you have resources available? You produce a high-level resource plan, how many iterations are you going to need, but it's relatively short planning compared to the linear life cycle.
I'm getting the impression that the linear life cycle, that detailed planning is really detailed planning, and we're looking at our scope, our requirements, our outputs in a lot of detail, scheduling all of that, whereas the iterative life cycle very much looking at a higher level resource plan, looking at the iterations, fixing our time and our cost, but leaving that scope much more flexible.
Exactly. So at this point, you just know the high level functionality, and then you fix your time and your resources.
So when is an iterative life cycle more applicable? What type of project would benefit from that life cycle?
So iterative life cycles are quite suitable for projects that need a lot of flexibility, where the scope is not well known, or when you want to work very close with your users and you want the agility to be able to adapt and to flex it. So very common in IT projects, very
Yeah.
common in innovation, digital projects,
Yeah.
communication projects. You don't want to be working on a new website or IT system for 2 years, and then in 2 years you give it to the users and it's not quite
Yeah.
how it works, because technology moves so fast. So
Absolutely.
it's quite good to do it incrementally.
Yes.
And then the added advantage is that you also get the benefit earlier. So you may have something in the market that is already generating return on investment
Yeah.
for that project.
What about limitations then? Are there any disadvantages in certain projects using the iterative life cycle?
It poses more challenges when it comes to resource management. You have your fixed resources, and sometimes they may be more management to ensure they are not over allocated or underutilized for the work, because you work with the resources that you
Yeah.
have. Another disadvantage could be because it relies a lot on the feedback from users and stakeholder engagement. If you don't have your users engaged, if the users change, if you're working with different people, that could possibly hinder your project. And the other key disadvantage is it becomes much more complex in terms of the delivery. So when you integrate and you test your products, like a new IT system, you
Yeah.
need to ensure that the new features you're delivering in this iteration will work well with those existing features you delivered in previous
Yeah.
iterations.
So that's the linear life cycle, the iterative life cycle. The final type of life cycle then is the hybrid life cycle. So I'm guessing this is a blend of the two.
Yes, that's the best of both, isn't it?
Yeah.
So you take a pragmatic view and you mix the different elements of the more traditional life cycles and the more adaptative elements of the iterative
Yeah.
projects. And it's good in a way because you could then maintain the rigor and the structure and the
Yeah.
predictability of the traditional linear projects, but then you can incorporate a little bit more flexibility.
Yeah.
So yes, it's a combination of the two. You
Yeah.
still have your concept, definition, deployment, and transition as per linear, but within those phases, you can incorporate the iterative elements.
You can be really innovative with how you use the hybrid life cycle. You can have certain packages of work that are using a waterfall, more predictive method. You can have other work packages that are using iterative development. You can really design a life cycle using the hybrid approach that fits the specific needs of your project.
Yes, exactly.
Are there any limitations to a hybrid approach? It sounds as if it's the best of both worlds.
It is the best of both, but it's also the more complex,
Okay.
because that is going to add more complexity in the
Yeah.
management and the governance of the project. It's a cultural change as well. This is quite new approach. So
Yeah.
we need to come to terms that organizations and teams may need to adapt culturally to embrace this hybrid approach.
We've covered those two learning outcomes. So our second learning outcome in the syllabus, Carmen, is then that we've got to have knowledge of the differences between a project life cycle and an extended life cycle. What goes on in an extended life cycle?
So an extended life cycle include all the phases of a linear project: concept, definition, deployment, transition, but also the adoption. So the products that were transitioned to the business as usual in a linear life cycle will have to be embedded in the organization. They'll have to be adopted by the users. So sometimes this is quite a big undertake. So sometimes we need a project team to be involved in that adoption. So this is where the extended life cycles come to place. I would say the key differences are probably three. So the first one, as we said, are the phases. It includes adoption and also the benefit realization, because you need to ensure that the outcome has been achieved, so the change has been adopted.
Yeah.
The second difference is the accountability of the project manager. In a linear project, you deliver your output, commission, hand it over to the client, happy days. In an extended, the project manager remains accountable for ensuring the outcome has been achieved. So the project manager often will be involved in the benefits reviews because it has a vested interest. So that's another difference in extended.
Yeah.
And the third difference is the suitability. So we tend to see linear life cycle more when you deliver things to an external client,
Yeah.
but often internal projects tend to gravitate towards an extended life cycle because you want to make sure that it's been embedded by the organization correctly.
And I guess that when we're talking about an extended life cycle, it could be extended by quite some time to include adoption and benefits realization.
It depends how much of a change management exercise is required as well. So when you start planning for that transition at the outset of the project, you may realize that actually this is going to take quite a lot of time to embed. This is a quite significant change.
Actually, it might be more successful in an extended life cycle to maintain that focus on benefits realization.
It is, because once you close the project, the team will disband.
Absolutely.
There will be resources will be allocated to other projects. So if operations need support from the project because they not fully have adopted the products, then you don't have the availability for the project team or even the project manager to support with that.
So let's turn our attention now to our final learning outcome. This is all about the choice of the life cycle. Are you going to have linear? Is it going to be extended, iterative, or hybrid? What can affect our choice of life cycle? What are some of those factors, Carmen, from your experience that have affected your decision as to whether or not you should use a linear or an iterative life cycle?
Yeah, it's a really good question because, as we said at the start, it's a big decision. It's quite a crucial decision.
Absolutely.
And there are going to be a lot of things influencing that decision. So one of the parameters is the type of organization.
Yeah.
For example, it depends on the sector. Some sectors are quite heavily regulated, like medical application, for example, certain industries like construction, where health and safety is important, nuclear sector, railways, infrastructure. So in that context, you need something that gives you the maximum control and governance, so your linear life cycle may be a better choice. If you have an organization that is rapidly evolving, like technology, you have a lot of volatility, complexity. We're going to talk in another podcast about how to assess that context. But if you have volatility, rapidly evolving, very uncertain context, then your agile, your iterative life cycle may be more suitable.
Yeah,
so context is the first one. The other one is the culture of the organization. Some organizations may be more inflexible, reluctant to take change. So if you want a more rigorous control of your changes, then a linear life cycle may appeal more for you. If you are in an organization where they may want more flexibility or they may be willing to take a little bit more risk, then perhaps they may go for iterative life cycle.
And for iterative life cycle, we're talking about culture of organizations. I can see that if the culture of a software development organization, if they develop software in BAU in a much more iterative, agile way, then it would be quite strange to do linear types of projects. You want to have a project life cycle that matches your BAU environment as well.
Yes, and it doesn't need to be one or the other. Some organizations will say, well, for these type of projects, for infrastructure projects, we're going to do linear. For IT projects, we're going to do hybrid.
Absolutely. And maybe certain teams within projects as well. When we're networking the IT elements of this particular project, we'll do that in an iterative life cycle, but the rest will be managed in a linear life cycle.
And this is why hybrid is becoming a bit more popular, because sometimes we try to use one approach for one project, but there may be some particular work packages where you need maybe to do some prototyping and you need to review. So sometimes we have a mix of approaches, and this is why it's quite important to make that decision from the outset, because for the project manager, this is going to be key to know. The choice of the life cycle will affect the project manager in the way they plan their resources, the scope is defined, how things are reviewed, what processes need to be followed.
Absolutely. So we need to make those decisions quite early on, don't we? Because they're going to affect pretty much everything that we're going to do, how we're going to structure our project.
Even funding, I was just thinking right now about the funding. If your project is funded by public funding or from a grant, the funding will be released at the key gates or up to completion of certain milestones.
Yeah.
Whereas if you want an approach where you just want to release a pot of funding per iteration, then it suits better an iterative life cycle.
That's been really interesting, Carmen. I think we've covered off all of those learning outcomes. We've had a good discussion about linear, iterative, and hybrid life cycles. We've talked about the extended life cycle as well. I think we've got a really good appreciation of which circumstances it would be better to use certain life cycles. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Bye-bye.
Bye.